Hello, hello, hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. That means that I basically live and breathe the Tolkien works, the Legendarium, the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, Unfinished Tales, all of that stuff. And I'm constantly trying to both learn and teach as much as I can about these works. And therefore, you can ask me any question about the Lord of the Rings, or the Hobbit, or the Silmarillion, or any of Tolkien's works, and I will do my best to answer you. Even if not right away, I might have to do some research. That's why I have a pile of books sitting over here. But anyway, let's get to today's video, where we are going to answer 19 of your questions. We have quite a few. I'm going to try to get through them as quickly as I can. And of course, I'm going to do a reading for you. But first off, I just want to say, if you want to ask a question, you can feel free to do so in the comments or whatever. You might notice I've gone back to the regular music. I tried something different last week. I wasn't really pleased with the way it came out. And there was even one person who commented saying that the music was... what was the word they used? I think stressful was the word they used, and I gotta be honest, I understand that. So I'm not gonna use the Super Nintendo music anymore. It was fun for once, but definitely don't want to do it all the time. Especially when it gets into that Moria ton. It can be a bit much when you're trying to listen to someone talk about the Lord of the Rings. But anyway, if you want to ask a question, you can feel free to do so in the comments. Leave me any kind of comments you want, and I'll get back to you. If you want to be featured in a video, the easiest way to do so, you want to ask me a question on Quora. If you look at the description, there's a link that goes to my Quora account. Just hit that little ask button, write up a question, no problem. Or if you already have a Quora account, and one is very easy to make, you can just go ahead and ask a question, and it'll recommend people for you to ask, and I'll show up. If it's anything about Tolkien, I'll show up, trust me. But anyway, I'm going to do a reading from Unfinished Tales today, and we're going to do a little bit of the disaster of the Gladden Fields, which is the story of what happened to Isildur, his final doom and everything. So let's get on with that. There was a pause, though the most keen-eyed among the Dunedain said that the orcs were moving inward, stealthily, step by step. Elendur went to his father, who was standing, dark and alone, as if lost in thought. "Atarinya," he said, "what of the power that would cow these foul creatures, and command them to obey you?" "Is it then of no avail?" "Alas, it is not, Senya. I cannot use it. I dread the pain of touching it, and I have not yet found the strength to bend it to my will. It needs one greater than I now know myself to be. My pride has fallen. It should go to the keepers of the three." At that moment there came a sudden blast of horns, and the orcs closed in on all sides, flinging themselves against the Dunedain with reckless ferocity. Night had come and hope faded. Men were falling, for some of the greater orcs leaped up 2 at a time, and dead or alive with their weight bore down a Dunedain, so that other strong claws could drag him out and slay him. The orcs might pay 5 to 1 in this exchange, but it was too cheap. Cirion was slain in this way, and Aratan mortally wounded in an attempt to rescue him. Elendur, not yet harmed, sought Isildur. He was rallying the men on the east side, where the assault was heaviest, for the orcs still feared the Elendilmere that he bore on his brow, and avoided him. Elendur touched him on the shoulder, and he turned fiercely, thinking an orc had crept behind. "My king," said Elendur, "Cirion is dead and Aratan is dying. Your last counselor must advise, nay, command you, as you commanded Otar. Go. Take your burden, and at all costs bring it to the keepers, even at the cost of abandoning your men and me." "King's son," said Isildur, "I knew that I must do so, but I feared the pain. Nor could I go without your leave. Forgive me and my pride that has brought you to this doom." Elendur kissed him. "Go. Go now," he said. Isildur turned west, and drawing up the ring that hung in a wallet from a fine chain about his neck, he set it upon his finger with a cry of pain, and was never seen again by any eye upon Middle-earth. But the Elendilmere of the west could not be quenched, and suddenly it blazed forth red and wrathful as a burning star. Men and orcs gave way in fear, and Isildur, drawing a hood over his head, vanished into the night. Of what befell the Dunedain, only this was later known. Ere long they all lay dead, save one, a young esquire stunned and buried under the fallen men. So perished Elendur, who should soon afterwards have been king, and as all foretold who knew him in his strength and wisdom, and his majesty without pride, one of the greatest, the fairest of the seed of Elendil, most like to his grandsire. Now of Isildur it is told that he was in great pain and anguish of heart, but at first he ran like a stag from the hounds, until he came to the bottom of the valley. There he halted to make sure that he was not pursued, for orcs could track a fugitive in the dark by scent, and needed no eyes. Then he went on more warily, for wide flats stretched on to the gloom before him, rough and pathless, with many traps for wandering feet. So it was that he came at last to the banks of Anduin in the dead of night, and he was weary, for he had made a journey that the Dunedain on such ground could have made no quicker, marching without halt and by day. The river was swirling dark and swift before him. He stood for a while, alone and in despair. Then in haste he cast off all his armor and weapons, save a short sword at his belt, and plunged into the water. He was a man of strength and endurance that few, even of the Dunedain of that age, could equal. But he had little hope to gain the other shore. Before he had gone far, he was forced to turn almost north against the current, and strive as he might, he was ever swept down towards the tangles of the Gladden Fields. They were nearer than he had thought, and even as he felt the stream slacken, and had almost won across, he found himself struggling among great rushes and clinging weeds. There suddenly he knew that the ring had gone. By chance, or chance well used, it had left his hand, and gone where he could never hope to find it again. At first, so overwhelming was his sense of loss that he struggled no more, and would have sunk and drowned. But swift as it had come, the mood passed. The pain had left him. A great burden had been taken away. His feet found the riverbed, and heaving himself up out of the mud, he floundered through the reeds to a marshy islet close to the western shore. There he rose up out of the water, only a mortal man, a small creature lost and abandoned in the wilds of Middle-earth. But to the night-eyed orcs that lurked there on the watch he loomed up, a monstrous shadow of fear, with a piercing eye like a star. They loosed their poisoned arrows at it and fled. Needlessly, for Isildur, unarmed, was pierced through heart and throat, and without a cry he fell back into the water. No trace of his body was ever found by elves or men. So passed the first victim of the malice of the masterless ring, Isildur, second king of all the Dunedain, lord of Arnor and Gondor, and in that age of the world, the last. That's pretty heavy stuff. So that's what happened with Isildur. And sometimes I get into this mode on Quora where I'll just casually mention that Isildur was traveling north to see the elves, that he was traveling specifically to see Elrond and Imladris, and to bring them the ring because he had seen the wisdom of Elrond's words in Mordor at the end of the Second Age, that the ring should be destroyed, and that he realized that it should be so, and he was seeking Elrond's counsel in the idea of destroying the ring. And people say, no, he was going home, he was going to Arnor to reclaim his throne. He was doing that, but he also was going to Elrond, and you can see it very clearly there. They talk about the ring and how he had tried to master it, and that his pride had fallen, and that he wished to go to the keepers of the three, of course referring to the elves. So that being said, let's get into your questions. Okay, like I said, I have a lot to get through today. We have 19 questions total, so let's get right into it. So this first question, this was an anonymous one, but I think this is a really fun question. Were Smeagol and Deagol brothers? So they were not brothers, but they were certainly related in some way. In The Hobbit, Smeagol did not say much about how he came to receive the One Ring, but he called it a birthday present. It came to me on my birthday, it's my birthday present, and so on and so on. In The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf reveals that he has wrested the truth, or at least something close enough to the truth, out of Gollum, and in this account he only refers to Deagol as a friend. So I'm going to read that quote from The Fellowship of the Ring. He had a friend called Deagol, of similar sort, sharper-eyed but not so quick and strong. On a time they took a boat and went down to the Gladden Fields, where there were great beds of iris and flowering reeds. You see where I wanted to start with this after reading the disaster of the Gladden Fields, so you can see that it was in that same spot with all the reeds and everything where Isildur fell. There Smeagol got out and went nosing about the banks, but Deagol sat in his boat and fished. Suddenly a great fish took his hook, and before he knew where he was dragged out and down into the water, to the bottom. Then he let go of his line, for he thought that he saw something shining in the riverbed, and holding his breath he grabbed at it. Gandalf makes no mention of Deagol as being related to Smeagol. He just calls him a friend, but he later states that Smeagol's grandmother seemed to be the matriarch of their small community, their clan. And it is possible that the community was just one big family. From this, we could surmise that Smeagol and Deagol were related and were possibly cousins. So in letter 214 from the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien goes into great detail about the Hobbitish custom of giving and receiving gifts on birthdays, and the difference inherent to Smeagol expecting to receive a gift on his birthday, even noting that Deagol had already given him a gift, contrasted with the Shire hobbits' custom of giving gifts on their birthdays, as it had been mentioned that usually such gifts were mathams, which were inexpensive trinkets of no particular importance, just things you like to have. Bilbo was known to be extravagantly generous on his birthday. He gave out expensive and personalized gifts, so he was sort of an outlier. In this letter, Tolkien also states that Smeagol and Deagol are related, and he comes to the same conclusion that his community were related to each other, but he did not specify the exact nature of Smeagol and Deagol's relation. I'm going to read you from letter 214. A trace of this can be seen in the account of Smeagol and Deagol, modified by the individual characters of those rather miserable specimens. Deagol, evidently a relative, as no doubt all of the members of the small community were, and already given his customary present to Smeagol, though they probably set out on their expedition very early in the morning. Being a mean little soul, he grudged it. Smeagol, being meaner and greedier, tried to use the birthday as an excuse for an act of tyranny, because I wants it was his frank statement of his chief claim. He also implied that Deagol's gift was a poor and insufficient token, hence Deagol's retort that on the contrary it was more than he could afford. So we can deduce that they were cousins, however, and in this same exact letter earlier on, Tolkien stated that when Gandalf said, "I guess," in relation to some of the information about Smeagol's early life, it would be more accurately modernized as "I deduce" in modern English. So I don't think the professor would begrudge me deducing that they were certainly cousins, because if they had a closer, more fraternal bond, if they were brothers, I think it would have been worthy of mention in the text. And as friends, as much as these rather miserable specimens can be friends with each other, they were likely close in age, meaning that their relation was not uncle and nephew. I mean, it can be possible for that to be the case. I have a friend whose niece is only like 2 years younger than her, so that can happen, but I think it's most likely that they're from the same generation and that they're cousins. Okay. Next question. This one was asked by Michael Fafare, who asks, in The Hobbit, what are the governance arrangements in the Shire? So basically, you're asking, what is the government of the Shire? The Shire does have a government, but it's mostly ceremonial. The Shire is in part of Arnor, which is the Northlands that lie between Lindon in the east and the Misty Mountains. Lindon in the west and the Misty Mountains in the east. So it was under the jurisdiction of the King of Arnor and the High King of the Realm of Men. After Arnor's last king, the realm of Arnor got fractured into 3 pieces. One of these was called Arthedain, and that's where the Shire was located, or would be located. That's where Bree was, for example. So the last king of Arthedain, well, actually not the last king of Arthedain, but the last important king of Arthedain, at least in terms of the Shire, was Argaleb II, because he actually founded the Shire, and he was approached by hobbits from Bree, and they asked to get permission to settle these lands and have a hobbit area, and he said yes. So the Shire did have a king, though they also elected a hobbit leader called the Mayor of Meneldil, and it was just mostly a ceremonial role. It gave them a sense of representation. The mayor was elected every 7 years, and it do not appear to be any term limits. Samwise was mayor 7 times in a row, so you think he was mayor for 49 years. After there were no more kings in Arthedain, or Arnor in general, the hobbits appointed a leader that was their de facto king, and he was the Thane, and that became a bloodline. And it generally fell to the Tooks. Peregrine became the Thane after his father's death, and then his son became Thane after his death. So the Thane's role was more governmental, enforcing the laws, and they kept the same laws that they had from the King of Arnor, because they were laws that they preferred. In the Fourth Age, they did have a king again. It was Aragorn, and though he did institute a ban on men in the Shire, and he expanded the borders of the Shire to include both Buckland and Westmarch, he basically left them alone. He let them govern themselves as they see fit. And of course, like I mentioned, Peregrine became the Thane, Samwise became the mayor. Frodo had a very brief bit as like sort of deputy mayor while Will Whitfoot was indisposed, and then Whitfoot was not indisposed and he was the mayor, and then once he stepped down, it was Samwise. Okay, next question, and this one's anonymous. When the Nazgul first tried to get the ring and were tricked into going into the wrong room, why did they not just check the other rooms? So you're referring to Bree when the rooms are broken into and ransacked and everything. And in the films, you explicitly see the Nazgul sneak in there and stab the beds. And this was actually taken from Ralph Bakshi's film, which did pretty much the same exact scene. In the book, we don't get to, quote-unquote, see that scene. We're just told of the aftermath of it. And there's actually been a long-standing argument between Tolkien scholars and Tolkien fans over the years of, was that actually the Nazgul, or was it agents of the Nazgul, some of the foul men that were in Bree? And certainly that was what Aragorn seemed to think, but let's assume it was the Nazgul, because it was certainly done on their orders. Now, it does seem odd that somebody who, whether it was Nazgul or not, had discovered that they had been deceived, that there were no hobbits in the room, that they wouldn't just check the other rooms. But when you really think about it, why would they do that? So the whole idea of the decoys, that was Nob, who was the assistant to Barlaman. And he was a hobbit that worked there, and he came up with the whole idea. And Pippin did ask that question. And I'm going to read you the relevant part of the Fellowship of the Ring. "Well, master," said Nob, "I've ruffled up the clothes and put a bolster down the middle of each bed, and I made a nice imitation of your head with a brown wooden mat, Mr. Underhill, sir," he added with a grin. Pippin laughed. "Very lifelike," he said. "But what will happen when they have penetrated the disguise?" "We shall see," said Strider. "Let us hope to hold the fort until morning." So in the next chapter, which is A Knife in the Dark, we get to see what happened. As soon as Strider had roused them all, he led the way to their bedrooms. When they saw that, they were glad that they had taken his advice. The windows had been forced open and were swinging, and the curtains were flapping, the beds were tossed about, and the bolsters slashed and flung about the floor. The brown mat was torn to pieces. So the Nazgul, or whoever, came in through the window, smashed up the beds. They found no hobbits, they found no ring. Earlier in the same chapter, some other Nazgul, led by Camul, broke into Frodo's house in Crickhollow and were stymied by the fast thinking of Fatty Bulger, who ran out the back and raised the alarm. Hobbits gathered with torches, and they were on alert, and Camul fled. So in Bree, we definitely know that there were Nazgul in Bree, but whether it was the Nazgul or somebody being controlled by them, they did sneak in through the window, and they didn't find the hobbits. So they realized they'd been tricked. So their next thought isn't going to be, oh, they must have moved rooms. Their next thought is going to be, they must be gone. They must have left already. Nob left bolsters to look like sleeping hobbits. It was an obvious decoy meant to deceive. So they had no reason to believe that they had the incorrect room. It was clearly the right room because there were decoys there. But they had every reason to believe that their prey had escaped. The Nazgul, or whoever, but certainly the knowledge would come back to the Nazgul if it was men that did this. And I do believe that it was the Nazgul, by the way. They believed that the hobbits were long gone, and so they left. They had not counted, I should say, on the intervention of Strider, moving them into another room, just as they had not counted on there being a hobbit living in Frodo's house, dressed in his clothes. That was not Frodo, another deception. So in hiding in a different room, they were basically tricking them into believing that they were gone, which gave them a bit of time to plan and prepare the next stage of their journey. Okay, next question is from Stuart Schiffman, who asks, how did the Great Eagles know where Frodo and Sam were and that they were still alive to get to them in time to save them? They didn't know any of that, but they were just going where Gandalf asked them to go. Gandalf had a bit of a history with Gwaihir, who was the Lord of the Eagles. Gandalf once tended a wound that Gwaihir had, which gained him a favor, which he used up in The Hobbit, as Gwaihir and the Eagles bore Gandalf, Bilbo, and all the dwarves away. Well, I mean, they sort of bore Bilbo. Bilbo was sort of hanging on for dear life. In The Lord of the Rings, Gwaihir bears Gandalf 3 more times. The first being from Orthanc, and that was a favor to Radagast, who asked him to check on the situation. Notably, at this point, Gwaihir sort of complains about how heavy Gandalf is and says that he's not going to take him all the way to a place like Rivendell, or Lorien. But Gandalf says that's fine. He wanted to be set down in Rohan. And that's how Gandalf came to meet Shadowfax. The second time was bearing him from Xiraxagil. And that was likely a favor for Galadriel, because Galadriel had foreseen Gandalf's return. She was ready for him. She had a staff, she had robes ready to go. And Gwaihir remarked that Gandalf at this point was very light. He was not as heavy as he used to be. And although he was carrying him in a different way, he didn't have Gandalf on his back. He was grasping him in his claws. Now, the third time, Gwaihir and the Eagles arrived at Morannon, that's the Black Gate. After Sauron's fall, Gandalf asked for one more favor. And Gwaihir said that he would bear Gandalf wherever he may go, no matter how heavy he was, even if he was made out of stone. Now, I've always surmised that as an agent of Manwë, Gwaihir was asked by his one true master to assist the White in this hour. Gandalf asked for Gwaihir and 2 more eagles to fly him to Mount Doom, where he rescued Frodo and Sam. So it wasn't so much that the eagles knew exactly where Frodo and Sam would be and that they would be alive, but that Gandalf knew that Sauron had fell and that the ringbearer's task had been fulfilled, and knew that they had to be close by and were likely in danger. So the eagles didn't really know what was going on. Now, the fact that he did ask for 2 eagles and not 3 does sort of point to the fact that Gandalf had also foreseen that Gollum was no longer alive. And then I know in the film, it's Gandalf on Gwaihir, and then 2 more eagles, and a lot of people say the 3rd eagle was for Gollum, and this is not true. The eagles were for Gandalf, Frodo, and Sam. The reason that there's an eagle without anybody is because, for whatever reason, they chose to have Frodo sort of very different in the films in terms of how strong he is, and he was pretty much conked out at that point, and Gandalf brought him onto Gwaihir with him instead of putting him on an eagle, so a little bit of a difference there. Anyway, next question is from Alice Stone, who asks, what is your favorite story of Tolkien being a devoted father? So, to me, nothing could be more devoted than the fact that he allowed his children, particularly Christopher Tolkien, but really all of his children, to help shape his stories. It's an often told story that The Hobbit started as a bedtime tale told to Christopher, who was around 5 years old at the time. Christopher had what he later referred to as a great concern with petty consistency, and would point out errors of continuity to his father, down to things like the color of Bilbo's door or the color of the tassels on Thorin's hood. Most people know that story. That, confound the boy, and he started writing things down. But how did this get the professor to start writing details down? This is interesting because we must ask ourselves, if you're telling a bedtime story to your child, and they start saying, well, you said Bilbo's door was blue, and now you're saying it's green, and this and that, most parents would say, are you telling the story or am I? That's the reaction that you would expect from a typical parent who just wants their child to go to sleep. They're telling the story out of obligation. Tolkien thought differently about children. He didn't just want his son to hear the story and fall asleep. He wanted him to respect the story. He wanted him to enjoy the story. Tolkien had a great respect for children. I'm going to read a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien about children. He said, "Children aren't a class. They are merely human beings at different stages of maturity. All of them have a human intelligence, which even at its lowest is a pretty wonderful thing, and the entire world is in front of them. It remains to be seen if they rise above that." Tolkien would bristle at the thought that anyone would refer to The Hobbit as strictly a children's tale, Not that it wasn't suitable for children, but that he thought of it as a story for everyone. It's a story for everyone that included children. So it was sort of like rated G in the traditional sense of general audiences, right? Not as in the sense of this is a children's book. Christopher echoed his father's sentiments, and he called the pigeonholing of The Hobbit as a children's tale sob stuff. So all of his children, chiefly Christopher, but all of them really became his editors and his critics, and they helped him shape his story, and he respected their opinions, possibly above anyone else. He abandoned plot lines that his children either deemed silly or that he feared would not hold up to their scrutiny. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. If all 4 hobbits had died shortly after the Fellowship set out, with which of the remaining 5 members would be best suited to be the ring-bearer for the remainder of the journey? So this is an interesting question. I think that when we get into speculation like this, it's a lot of fun actually to think about things like this. Obviously, Tolkien didn't write the story that way, but it's fun to think about, what we know of the characters. What would they do in that situation? So I think that there's a definite answer, and the answer is Gimli. So if we look at the Fellowship, and then we have 9 of them, and 4 of them, like I said, the hobbits just die pretty early on. Let's say they're not going to turn back. They're not going to go back to Rivendell to gather more members, or to possibly take Bilbo with them, which I don't think they would do if 4 hobbits had already died, and especially since Bilbo was very old at this point. They would have to choose one of their remaining members to carry the ring to Mordor. I don't think that they would turn back, but I think that they definitely wouldn't endanger Bilbo, especially after the death of his cousins and Samwise, who he adored. So I think Boromir would be the first one to volunteer to take the ring, but he didn't want to take the ring to Mordor. He wanted to take the ring to Gondor, to Minas Tirith, so they wouldn't let him have the ring. Gandalf was too afraid to touch the ring, and I think Aragorn was in that same sort of boat. He wouldn't want to touch the ring. So this leaves Legolas and Gimli, and Legolas, I don't think he would want to touch the ring. Gimli is sort of the natural choice for a ring bearer in the absence of Frodo or Samwise. Dwarves have shown strong resistance to Sauron's magic, and he was willing to go to Mordor. Aragorn himself even planned to split the Fellowship with himself, Frodo, Sam, and Gimli, going to Mordor, while the rest would follow Boromir to Minas Tirith, with the possibility that Legolas might want to go home at that point, but I think Legolas was too invested. So I can't say that Gimli would have succeeded as ring-bearer, but I think that he would be the most likely candidate. All right, next question. This one's anonymous. Why was Meneldil pleased to see Isildur leave Gondor? Wouldn't they have been close, considering they were kin and spent a great deal of time together? So this is interesting because it's from the story The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, which I just read a little bit for you at the beginning of the video. But really, we can't know. We can only guess the answer to that question. Meneldil is, historically speaking, very interesting. He's the first king of Gondor to rule alone. And the fact that he was the last man to be born in Numenor. That being said, the idea that he was glad that his uncle and his cousins were traveling to the north and he wished that they would stay there for a long time was from a footnote in The Disaster of the Gladden Fields. I'm going to read you that footnote. Meneldil was the nephew of Isildur, son of Isildur's younger brother Anarion, slain in the siege of Barad-dûr. Isildur had established Meneldil as king of Gondor. He was a man of courtesy, but far-seeing, and he did not reveal his thoughts. He was in fact well pleased by the departure of Isildur and his sons, and hoped their affairs in the north would keep them occupied. Author's note: it is stated in unpublished annals concerning the heirs of Elendil that Meneldil was the 4th child of Anarion, that he was born in the year 3318 of the Second Age, and that he was the last man to be born in Numenor. The note just cited is the only reference to his character. Unfinished Tales it's fantastic as a great bit of lore, but it is a lot of unfinished stories. That being said, Christopher Tolkien's note there states that Meneldil's glee at Isildur and his sons leaving for Arnor was really the only reference to his character, meaning that as Meneldil was a character in the story and that he existed, we don't really have any information about what kind of person he was other than this note, that he was glad that they left, that he was a man of courtesy, that he kept himself sort of guarded. Tolkien never expanded on the characterization of Meneldil further. This was the only view into his personality that we've ever gotten. So we can only guess, and my guess would be that as the first sole king of Gondor that was not ruling alongside a father or a brother, he was probably more than happy to get on with doing that, to being king, without having Isildur over his shoulder or his cousins around. He wanted to prove himself, I think. He was relatively young compared to all of these other guys, even though he was, I think, about 122 years at this point, somewhere around there. But yeah, he was a relatively young guy by Númenórean standards, and he wanted to be the king, and he wanted to get on with it. Okay, next question. This one's from Kelly Chan, who asks, why can Idril Celebrimbor return to Valinor? Isn't she one of the Noldor who left Valinor and were under the doom of Mandos, which forbade them from returning to Valinor? So, yeah, valid point. And this is one of those moments where I have to point out that the Silmarillion is not finished. And not only is it not finished, some of that is actually on purpose. And we have a lot of things that are based off of in-universe legends. So as it is written in the Silmarillion, we know that Tuor eventually grew old, and at this point he built a ship, and that him and Idril got on it, and they sailed off into the literal sunset. This snippet from the Silmarillion, which I'm going to read for you, is all that we get of their fate in that chronicle. In those days, Tuor felt old age creep upon him, and ever a longing for the deeps of the sea grew stronger in his heart. Therefore he built a great ship, and he named it Eriame, which is Sea-Wing. And with Idril Celebrimbor he set off into the sunset and the west, and came no more into any tale or song. But in the after days it was sung that Tuor alone of mortal men was numbered among the elder race, and was joined with the Noldor whom he loved, and his fate is sundered from the fate of men. So in The Fall of Gondolin, the book The Fall of Gondolin, we actually get a little bit less detail specifically about Tuor and Idril's fate. And I'm going to read you the snippet from The Fall of Gondolin. Here they abode very long indeed, and Meneldil was a grown boy ere the voice of Ulmo's conches drew the heart of Tuor, that his sea-longing returned with a thirst, the deeper for years of stifling. And all that host arose at his bidding, and got them down, Syrian, to the sea. So this second snippet is important to note, as The Fall of Gondolin starts with a snippet from Frodo, who is sort of a stand-in for Christopher Tolkien at this point, and he notes that Bilbo's work was sadly unfinished, that this is the most complete chronicle of The Fall of Gondolin, unfinished both in-universe and out, as of course Tolkien's Legendarium is unfinished, but he brilliantly left some aspects vague or unfinished on purpose in-universe, to give a sense of reality to a fantasy world. The scribes and the transcribes of the work cannot know everything. There is no omnipotent narrator, after all. In the first snippet from the Silmarillion, we were told that Tuor built a ship, and him and Idril sailed west, as a matter of fact. We know that. What becomes of them afterwards is vague. It is supposed that by grace of Iluvatar, Tuor became immortal and counted amongst the elves, and that along with Idril came to live in Valinor. It is not said how or why this happened, or even if it's true, but it is the subject of elvish lore. The second snippet merely notes that they dwelled where they dwelled, and that the unquiet of Ulmo, the sea longing, overcame Tuor, which is quite unusual for a mortal man to even have that, and he went to the sea. It does not mention him making the ship or sailing west, but we know from what the sea longing is that that's what he's going to do. Now, in a footnote, Findegal of Gondor notes that there is no actual source for the claims that Bilbo made in the story. He notes that Bilbo's source may have had its origin in Númenor, but that he doesn't specifically know where Bilbo was getting his information from in this snippet. Anyway, assuming that the elvish songs and legends are true, and that Idril did indeed bypass the ban on Noldor, we can wonder why, but I think it's quite simple. An exception was made. If Iluvatar sought to right a wrong of the circumstances of Tuor's birth as a man and not an elf, and make him immortal so that he may be counted amongst the elves and dwell in the Undying Lands, it's fairly easy to assume that his wife got to go with him, as she was already an elf. So, of course, she got to bypass the ban on the Noldor, and really the exile ban would only be lifted another 62 years later, which in the span of the Silmarillion, very short amount of time. Okay. Next question. This one's anonymous. According to the Andreth prophecy, we don't get to hear about the Andreth prophecy all that often, so this is cool. According to the Andreth prophecy, Turin fights in the War of Wrath and slays Ancalagon. Is this prophecy canon, and if Silmarillion movies are made, will they make Turin fight in the War of Wrath? So Andreth's prophecy is not canon. It's very interesting, though. In the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, there is a prophecy mentioned, and it's attributed to Andreth with no real context other than that there's sort of a linguistic note here about the language of the House of Halidin. So I'm going to read you that little snippet from The Peoples of Middle-earth. The language of the folk of Haleth is not used, for they had perished and would not rise again, nor would their tongue be heard again unless the prophecy of Andreth the Wise Woman should prove true, that Turin in the War of Wrath should return from the dead, and before he left the circles of the world forever, should challenge the great dragon of Morgoth and Calagan the Black, and deal him the death stroke. It seems bizarre to say that he would return from the dead, but we have to understand the way that death works for men in Tolkien's universe is that they have an allotted time that they spend on Arda, and when their time is up, they leave Arda. They go elsewhere. They go to where Iluvatar is. But Turin didn't live out his natural life. So it's possible to say that he would be in Mandos for a time, and that he would be brought from Mandos to Middle-earth to fight in the war. But this whole idea of Turin returning and fighting in the War of Wrath never came to fruition, because he wasn't there during the War of Wrath. He didn't fight at Calagan. It was Eonwe and Thorondor and the Eagles that fought and slew Ancalagon. The prophecy of Andreth was likely an early version of the Dagor-Dagorath idea, which blossomed into a lot more. The Dagor-Dagorath is a prophecy usually attributed to Namo, who's also called Mandos, and it says that Turin will return for the final battle, but they're not specifically talking about the War of Wrath. They're talking about the final battle in all of Arda, and that it will be Morgoth that he slays. This also was not included in the published Silmarillion because Christopher Tolkien had found a note from his father saying that any prophecy of Morgoth's return was not known to the Valar, so it may have even been abandoned at that stage, though it did go through several iterations and was way more fleshed out than the earlier Andreth prophecy. All right, next question. This one is anonymous. Why didn't Saruman search for the One Ring after he knew where Isildur took it from Sauron at the end of the Second Age? Did he know what happened to Gollum and Smeagol as well? Saruman did search for the ring, and he was probably the one to find Isildur's remains. It doesn't matter where Isildur got the ring, because that was Mordor. It matters where he had the ring when he died. The account of Isildur's death, which I read to you earlier in the video, made it certain the One Ring was somewhere around the Gladden Fields, or at least it had been. When Gandalf asks Saruman about the possibility of the One Ring being found, Saruman assured him that it had been washed away to sea, and it was gone forever. And it seemed that he had exclusive, special wisdom about this. He was so sure of himself. We later learn that after the War of the Ring, Aragorn found effects in Orthanc that could only have belonged to Isildur, and he surmised that Saruman had in fact found his ancestors' bones and had probably destroyed them. Of course, he could not find the ring, as it had already been found by Deagol and then taken by Smeagol. The location where Isildur took the ring didn't matter, where he had it when it abandoned him and he shortly after died, and Saruman did search that area, but he did not find the ring, for it was already gone. Okay, next question. This is from Ronald Dixon, who asks, if Thranduil sailed to the Undying Lands, would he be in for a rude awakening in Valinor when he's basically just a nobody compared to the elves there? No, of course Thranduil, you're referring to Legolas's father, the king of Mirkwood. While it is true that he wouldn't be a king anymore, it's not true that he would be a nobody. Thranduil was descended from a people called the Lathrum. They were an elvish people that lived in Doriath, and they were under the kingship of Iluvatar and Maeglin, who was an Ainur spirit. They were said to be the noblest of all the Sindar elves, so it's not like Thranduil would just be a nobody, and in fact, if he were to sail west, he would be reunited with his kin, including his father Orfer and Iluvatar himself. It's just likely that he wouldn't sail west. He likes ruling Mirkwood, and after the War of the Ring, with the Shadow gone and Dol Guldur being cast down, his realm was going to get fairer, so he would probably want to stick around for that. Okay, next question is also from Ronald Dixon. Would Galadriel be able to return to the mainland of Valinor, or would she have been confined to Tol Eressëa? So there's nothing preventing Galadriel or any of the other Noldor exiles who are welcome back returning to Aman, or going to Valinor, or Eldamar, or any of the other lands in the Undying Lands. Many exiles did in fact choose to live in Eressëa, and Tolkien referred to this as a purgatorial thing. It was self-imposed, though. It was their choice. They weren't told that they had to stay in Eressëa. They chose to stay there. And by using the term purgatorial, Tolkien suggests that it's temporary, that they will eventually feel comfortable returning to Aman and rejoining the Noldor, and they could visit Valinor. All restrictions were lifted upon allowing them to sail west. And of course, Galadriel was a bit of a different situation, but she was allowed to sail west. And no sort of purgatory nor probation was required. All instances of either would be made by the choice of those particular elves. Okay. Next question. This one is from two people actually asked me this question. It was asked by Violet Rose and also requested by Dutch Patterson. Because if you see a question on Quora that somebody else asked, you can still request somebody to answer it. If you don't see an answer on a question that's already there, or you don't see a satisfactory answer, you could hit request an answer, and if you see my name on there, you could certainly do that. Okay, so this one's interesting because it's about pronunciation. Okay, so if I read the question, I'm sort of revealing the pronunciations anywhere, but this person is asking, how do you pronounce the Tolkien elven names, like, and I'm going to spell it out. Feanor is the first one. Eol, that's the second one. Maedhros, that's the third. The fourth is Aegnor, and the last is Maeglin. So there's actually a sort of a rudimentary pronunciation guide that can be found in both the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. It doesn't really list very many individual names, but it gives you the framework needed to understand how the linguistics work and get the pronunciations. So going by that, of course I'm going to help you. So the first one. The guy that made the Oath, the guy that made the Silmarils, how do you say his name? Now you notice it's Feanor, and there's two little dots above the E, and what that indicates is that the E is its own syllable. So what you get is Feanor. That's how you say his name, Feanor. Now, the accent is on Feanor. It's not Feanor, it's Feanor. Because in Elvish names, it's custom for the second to last syllable to have the accent. And even though Feanor seems to be 3 syllables, Anor is sort of treated as a single syllable. So the next one, Eol. Now this one's interesting because we do have the 2 dots above the E indicating that it is in fact its own syllable. But in this case, the name is not tied to any specific Elvish language or any meaning. The character is a Sindar elf, which suggests that his name would be Sindarin, but the name has no relation to any Sindar words or pronunciation. In The War of the Jewels, Christopher Tolkien notes that this name is meaningless and was derived from a primitive version of the story of the Fall of Gondolin. So it's a holdover from a very old draft. So either way, I would say that there's probably no correct pronunciation because the name doesn't have meaning. But if we follow the rules of how Sindarin works, because we have to assume as a Sindar elf that his name is likely Sindarin, it's Eol. With Eol. Not Eol, but Eol. So then we have Maedhros. Now, there are no dots above the E here, indicating that the first half is not Mea. It's not Mea. It's Ma. Well, actually, not Ma. It's Ma. Like, it rhymes with cat, hat, ma. Now, then we get that DH. That's sort of like the soft TH in words like breathe or father. So, therefore, it's Maedhros. Similarly, Aegnor, Aegnor, and Maglin is Maeglin. So that's how you say them. I'm going to say them all again for you. Feanor, Eol, Maedhros, Aegnor, and Maeglin. Okay. Next question. This one's anonymous. Why did Eonwe tell Sauron that he was not permitted to judge one of his own order, yet he arrested Morgoth? Because arresting a person and judging a person is not the same thing, are they? Morgoth was being, as you say, arrested and brought back to Valinor, and he would be judged by Manwë under the supervision. Him being brought there was under the supervision of Eonwe. Only Manwë could render that sort of judgment. Eonwe was just transporting him there. What Sauron asked for was to be pardoned by Eonwe, and Eonwe did not have that authority. And he told Sauron that he did not have the authority to dole out a pardon to another Maya. That what he would have to do is travel to Valinor and ask Manwë for pardon. So Sauron was ashamed, and he did not do this. Possibly because the war was over and Sauron was repentant, and as the witnesses have said, he was genuinely repentant at this point. They didn't make any sort of attempt to force him or arrest him and bring him along. They just told him what to do, and they kind of assumed that he was going to do it because he was repentant at that point. So it had to be a choice that Sauron would make with his own free will. Okay, next question. This one's from Hal Santos, who asks, how much is it depicted or developed on matters of relations between Eru and the Ainur? Do they love, respect, fear, or hate Eru? For the most part, I would say that they loved Iluvatar, as he's called in Middle-earth, or Eru. I prefer the word Iluvatar, but either one's correct. They did fear him when appropriate to do so. There's not a lot of development on the relations between Iluvatar and his creations, but it is mentioned that they would sing to him, which might have given him the idea for Ainur Lindala, and they had all come individually or in small groups, but never all at once. They did become somewhat fearful during the Ainur Lindala. After the first theme, in which Melkor had rebelled and sang discordant music, starting the War of Music, Iluvatar just smiled. He was fine with it, and he simply led into the next theme. In the next theme, Melkor did not just seek to sing discordant themes, but sought to drown out Iluvatar's themes with sheer volume and in unison. Upon leading into the third and final theme, Iluvatar's face was terrible to behold, which indicates a level of fear from the Ainur, which was made explicit after he spoke. And I'm going to read you that relevant passage from the Silmarillion. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, that these things ye have sung, I will show them forth, and ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shall see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined. Then the Ainur were afraid, and they did not comprehend the words that were said to them, and Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar arose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he had made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. So, as for Melkor, the question of him hating Iluvatar is interesting. He was ashamed, and from that he became angry. Did he hate his creator? Probably, yeah. I think in a way he did, but in a way one might hate someone that they're jealous of. Because even before the Ainur Lindale, Melkor had sought out the secret fire in the void, for he lamented the emptiness and silence of the void, and he wanted to fill it with life. He could not find the secret fire, the flame imperishable, because it was within Iluvatar, and he imparted it into the center of Arda. later on. Melkor later saw himself as the Lord of Arda, though he sought dominion chiefly over Middle-earth. Melkor wished to remake the world in his image and fill it with his designs. He wanted to be God, which made him jealous and resentful of Iluvatar. Of the Ainur, other than Melkor, it's likely, he was probably alone in that specific feeling, at least at first. Tolkien stated that Sauron also wished to usurp Iluvatar and run the universe his way, micromanage down to the last detail. Okay, next question. This one's anonymous. Do elves age in The Lord of the Rings? This is the one from the thumbnail. It took us a while to get to it. Do elves age in The Lord of the Rings? How long do humans and dwarves live in The Lord of the Rings? So elves do age. It's a complex matter. Elves age from birth, of course. They become physically mature at about 50 years old, and they're considered adults at about 100 years old. Past this point, they seem to cease to age any further, though at the end of The Lord of the Rings, Frodo meets a very old, wrinkled elf with a long beard named Círdan. So Círdan was the oldest elf that was still in Middle-earth, and Tolkien had this idea that there would be a third stage of elvish life. After tens of thousands of years, elves would become physically old, though they still remained immortal. Tolkien later did not pursue this line of thinking, but Círdan remained physically old in The Lord of the Rings, so it's possible that Círdan's advanced age may be a sign of fading, which is a process by which the elven soul, which is called a Fea, overwhelms the body, which is called a Hroa. All elves are subject to eventually fade and become spiritual beings. This is their natural fate, and it may be their true final form, as it were. The process has happened unnaturally fast in Middle-earth because of the corruption of Melkor. It would still happen in the Undying Lands, but at a much, much slower pace. So we have some evidence that Melkor's his influence can prematurely age or fade elves, as there was an elf named Gwyndor who was captured and tortured by Melkor, and he escaped. And he was both aged and scarred to the point where his family didn't recognize him at first. Men, or humans if you prefer, have an allotted time. I spoke about this a little while ago. An average lifespan akin to the regular human lifespan in reality, though if they're killed before their time, they will wait in Mandos to depart. There are, of course, men that had heightened lifespans, such as the Dunedain, who on average lived about 250 years. Elros had lived to be 500 years, so his line, and the line of Dunedain in general, would eventually decline to become near that of normal men. Dwarves averaged around 250 years, though Durin the Deathless lived to be somewhat close to 2,500 years old, and he reincarnated 6 times into his own line. Dwarves wait in Mandos for the end of the world, at which point the second music will give them an afterlife. Okay, next question. This one is from Harry the Dinosaur, interesting name, who asks, what happened to Saruman's spirit after his expulsion from Valinor? I don't think expulsion is the exact word, because that suggests that he was in Valinor. It was more that he was denied re-entry. He was banned. After his bodily death in the Shire, everyone witnessed his spirit as a great wisp of smoke rise from his body and look to the west, and then it was blown away by a cold wind. He never made it back to Valinor, but he was denied entry. Being blown away by a wind suggests that it was Manwe, because Manwe was the king of the breath of Arda. And it leads us to strongly surmise that Manwe himself is basically scattering Saruman, much as was Sauron's fate. Saruman and Sauron likely were forced to silently and powerlessly wander Middle-earth, watching the world move on without them. Okay. Next question. This one's anonymous. If, as has been told, only 7 fathers of the dwarves were created, how did the race procreate? We weren't told that only 7 fathers of the dwarves were created. We are told that Aule did create 7 fathers of the dwarves, and that the race of dwarves would slumber until such a time that the firstborn children of Iluvatar, the Elves, had awakened. We are not told that Aule ceased creating dwarves, and we have no reason to believe that he did. The Silmarillion was unfinished, as I mentioned a few times, and the bit about the creation of the dwarves of Aule and Yavanna came late in the writing, and it was not really fully fleshed out. There are a great number of things that happened, but aren't explicitly said in the Silmarillion. Some of these things were published in other books. For example, the Battle of the Powers. The Elves were protected during the Battle of the Powers by 6 spirits, the 5 Guardians and Melian. The Guardians were the same exact spirits who became the Istari later on, and they continued to protect the Elves during the Great Journey. This seems like it should be in the Silmarillion, but it was actually in the book The Nature of Middle-earth. So just because we don't know exactly how many female dwarves Aule created or when he created them, that doesn't mean that he didn't do it. He had to have, otherwise the dwarves would not procreate at all. Okay, final question, and this is another anonymous one. If the ring made its wearer... Oh, I like this question. This is an interesting one. If the ring made its wearer invisible, why didn't this extend to Frodo's severed finger, which Sam could see within it after Gollum bit it off? So let's talk about what the ring actually does to a person, because invisibility is sort of an oversimplification. The wearer of the One Ring isn't invisible in the normal sense, but they are rather drawn into a spiritual realm that most beings cannot perceive. It's called the Wraith World. This is why, when wearing the ring, Frodo describes that the world around him becomes dimmer and blurry, but he could see wraiths very clearly, such as when he wore the ring at Amon Hen, he could see them bright and clear as day. This is also why the wraiths see him clearly when he wears the ring. Living people are vague shapes to them. That being said, it isn't even full invisibility on a functional level. It was mentioned by Bilbo that when he wore the ring, he could be seen as something like a very pale shadow if he was in very bright light, like direct sunlight. One example was when he was spotted by orcs as he was escaping from the Misty Mountains. He was sort of stuck in the door, he couldn't quite move it, and they saw something, sort of a flicker, a shimmer, and they said, "Over there," and he managed to squeeze himself through and escape. Now, let's address the question of Frodo's finger. We know for a fact that Sam did see the severed finger, and I'm going to read the relevant passage from the Return of the King. The fires below awoke in anger, the red light blazed, and all the cavern was filled with a great glare and heat. Suddenly Sam saw Gollum's long hands draw upwards to his mouth. His white fangs gleamed, and then snapped as they bit. Frodo gave a cry, and there he was, fallen upon his knees at the chasm's edge. But Gollum, dancing like a mad thing, held aloft the ring, a finger still thrust within its circle. It shone now, as if verily it was wrought of living fire. So, the answer to this is actually really simple. The One Ring can draw a person into the Wraith World, rendering them functionally invisible to most. However, a finger is not a person. Frodo's finger was bitten off. His finger's not a living being on its own. It's just dead flesh. To suggest that it should be invisible would be to suggest that any object that passes through it would become invisible. And that would mean that the chain that he wore it on would be invisible because it's going through the ring. To be drawn into the Wraith World, one must have Fea, soul. Gollum severed Bilbo's finger. He took off a piece of his body, his hroa, but he did not take off a piece of Frodo's soul with him. Knowing this, we can draw the conclusion that a corpse wearing the ring would be visible. Only living persons would be affected in such a matter. Anyway, for such a lot, I tried to keep it close to 15 questions, but we had a lot today that I really wanted to get through. And we got through it in a pretty good time. We're at about an hour right now, so I will see you guys next week. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, you must really like it. And for that, I thank you. And I hope that you hit the like button. And I hope that if you haven't subscribed, that you do. Send me some questions. I'll see you guys next time.